I'm so excited to do this for many reasons. One being, even though you under your breath said they fancy, when Karen was reading my bio, I have a confession. We have to start with a confession, which is I think Go Fish made me gay. So I do think that that trumps being fancy over and over again. But I I want to talk about what a cult is, like in the kind of substance of it, because both in your memoir and in what you just read, I think you give us a much better definition of cult than we normally have. So, I mean, if we could start with like, what is a cult? I would guess that most people in the audience will say, I'm not quite sure, but I know it when I see it. And because we assume that like from the outside there's something that we can tell that is a sign of the cult. Having been raised in what you call a cult, would you tell us what it is from the inside that makes it a cult?
I mean, that's a tricky question because in honesty, all honesty, it still pains me a little bit to call them a cult because I know that they wouldn't call themselves that. And because just in general, as a human, I feel like it's a good idea to not call anyone something they wouldn't call themselves, right? Even if it is a cult. And it was funny, you know, the population of people who say, I grew up in a cult too, is Catholics. Catholics always been like the Catholic Church is a cult. And I'm like, it's a really big one though, and you get to go home. That's, you know what I mean? And that's the I think the difference is or one of the hallmarks that really makes it not, organized religion is that you're isolated from mainstream culture, and in my case and in a lot of cases homeschooled, and in a lot of cases of a lot of the people I know who also grew up in cults taught doctrine rather than anything else. And that was kind of true of me growing up. They were obsessed with the U.S. presidents though, so I also just know the astrological histories of all of the U.S. presidents. FDR, Aquarius, just like Abraham Lincoln, JFK, Gemini. That's why he was always having affairs. This is my education. I mean, that's good stuff to know, but for cocktail parties. So I don't know what. There's also this conversation I'm connected with a lot of cult deprogrammers. They're not called interventionists. And if someone's over 18 and they've made a choice, even if to you it's your loved one and you can see their identity, slipping away, who are we to say? And what is the difference between, having an intense yoga and meditation practice with a guru that you admire and having that be kind of the center of your life and that being a cult? So, I mean, it's a slippery term is the point. And it's one I think, the number of times people have said to me, oh, cults, I'm obsessed with cults. And I'm like, are you also obsessed with human trafficking? Do you know what I mean? Like, why is it this? It's almost not real to people that it's a real thing that people get sucked into. That was just a whole lot of language to say that I struggle to define it.
But I think that that's sort of the point, right? That it is a word that's actually given from the outside. No one on the inside is in a cult. And, the phrase that keeps getting like volleyed in all of these like cult documentaries is nobody joins a cult. It's always like they join a group and they join for really, I think, ubiquitous and often moving reasons, right? They're looking for, as you say, acceptance, meaning, structure.
And escape from capitalism, nuclear family, the tyranny of all of these sort of structures that have just been imposed on us. I mean, some sort of utopian ideal, some sort of reimagining of how we can live. Sadly, it's actually seekers and idealists and people who are actually questioning the norm who end up being the ones that get sucked into this stuff, which is, I find that it's particularly sad to me that that's this kind of predatory nature preys on seekers.
And not on, the story that we have, I think, is that like people who join are these kind of feeble-minded dupes, which is clearly not the case. I think, we have to take seriously that people join for reasons that are honest and true, and people don't act against their own sense of themselves and what they need. And that actually most people don't join because they feel like their life lacks meaning. They join because they actually have a sense of meaning and they're looking for community.
Yeah. Yeah, I get emails and messages on various platforms almost daily from people who have just gotten out of cults, or interestingly, people who got out of cults a while ago but are ashamed and have never found a place or a way to talk about it because for people unlike me, people who chose to do it as adults, there's a lot of shame because people just assume that you are like even if you've been out for 10 years, it's still people are like, oh, you're actually like, there's something wrong with you, just complicated. Anyway.
But I think part of the history of cult deprogramming is this idea that you are a whole person and then you join a cult, and the language is of like brainwashing. That is, you lose yourself. Your mind is somehow taken from you. And the point of coming out is that you're given back to yourself. But that's not actually what happens, right? None of us are whole people.
Right.
And it's not as though, we are ever returned to ourselves. So I'm interested in your sense of what happens when you leave. What person did you become when you left? Because you left quite young. You were 11?
11 and a half, I would have said at the time, because I was really invested in being older. As I think a lot of people that age are, just dying to be like a teenager.
But I think most people would say, oh, you're so young, you actually became, like, that isn't who you are. You became a person in the world, right? But you were changed by the movement out into the world.
What's, I think, unique about my case is that I didn't leave. I, in fact, begged to stay. So my joke in my survivor community, can you call yourself a survivor if you beg to stay? Which I did. They sent me away because my mother had left and I had no biological parent in the family. But I spent at least a year strategizing how I was going to get back. And within that process, idealizing where I had come from and turning it into this Eden as where I actually was living was horrible and abusive, and only underlining that was a great place to be. And I was struggling, and then I was struggling with, oh no, I'm becoming a world person. I actually like people. I've made connections in this world, and I've been feeling corrupt and guilty and like, oh, I like pop music. Like, I think that Off the Wall is the Michael Jackson album is the most amazing thing I've ever heard, and I bet if the cult leader was still alive and he heard it, he would also be like, this is good. It might actually make it into the cult canon. And so I started to just struggle with identity, really, and sort of, admitting to myself that I didn't really want to go back because I had so much more freedom, and ultimately just feeling like I need to never talk about it again. If I'm gonna live in this world, I'm gonna commit to this identity that is from upstate New York or whatever, and because the looks on people's faces were always like, especially my age, 12, 13-year-olds are just like, I can't just maybe never say that again, because what you're talking about. So I became it turned me into an absolute chameleon. Studying people and being like, okay, that's how you act like a person in the world.
But that's, I think, part of what's so interesting and moving about your memoir is because you rely on your diaries from when you were a child and you leave when you're 11. There's a way in which actually what you're narrating is, I think, a standard story. Everybody thinks their childhood is normal until they enter into the real world. For most people, the real world is like kindergarten. So you're much younger. For you, the real world was when you were 11 and a half. But it is that kind of like radical alienation where you realize that like the kind of normal patterns of your family, the food you eat, the way you just live your life is not like everybody else's, and then learning how to be a world person. I think that we all do a version of it. You were just narrating it with a sense that what happened on the inside was actually quite different.
There were two things that I had to change ASAP. My homemade clothes. I looked like it was 1969 and it was 1979. And my hair. And my eye contact. This was the biggest lesson, and I felt the shift once I trained myself not to be the culty person. Like, so you could do this with the person sitting next to you. If I talk to you and I don't look away for, like, it's only been 5 seconds and it's uncomfortable, right?
That's cool.
I was never trained to look away. So like day 3 of school, this lovely girl who's still my friend was like, "You can't stare at people. You look weird." And I was like, "Oh," and then I was like, "Oh, how do you do that?" Like, it's because we do it so automatically, but we do it a billion trillion times in a given conversation. To learn no culty eyes.
But I mean, you could say that like you had grown up in France.
I would
Right?
have a French
okay.
accent. Yeah.
No, but that, the kind of like translation of what is totally normal and cultural looks different in a different world.
Yeah.
Right? And so again, I think that there's a way in which, I guess I have a counterfactual question. What would your memoir look like if you never used the word cult? Would the story have changed if that was never a word that got used or a frame of understanding how you grew up?
I probably wouldn't have been able to sell it.
Okay, fine.
For starters. And I only use the word cult once in this book, and it's me talking about Jim Jones and the Guyana massacre because I obsessively did my first book report ever on this subject, in no way thinking that it had anything to do with me. But I wrote this book very specifically from my perspective as a kid, because obviously I didn't even know that word as a kid, and that's not what my experience of it was. And it took me literally until I was in my 20s. So I had been out of it for years and years and years before I was like, oh, cult. I mean, it was a therapist actually who said, that was a cult. My first thought was rude. Like, you don't know my people, But I want to switch gears for a second because you said something really interesting when we were walking over that I want to hear more about, sort of what you think and what you've experienced. So they were telling me that they teach a cults class. It's sort of like cults and pop culture, yeah. And that it's a 600-person auditorium that fills up every time. So my question is, why do you think people are obsessed with cults? Why is it? And do you agree that it's having such a moment, in terms of documentaries and podcasts? And it just seems like in the last 5 years, it's cool. I'm cool because I grew up in a cult. What do you think on that?
Well, I'm so glad that you had said that, like, people come up to you and they say, I'm obsessed with cults, and you don't know how to react, because this is what happens to me every semester. 600 students say to me, I'm obsessed with cults, and I have to say, what does that mean to you? And what it means to them is they're consuming all of this cult culture, right? They're consuming narratives that already tell them it's a cult, right? Because cult stories start at the end. You can't start a cult story at the beginning. It has to start with, it's a cult. And it's a cult because something terrible happened.
Right.
Right? It all went to shit. The FBI showed up. The IRS showed up.
Right. Somebody showed up.
And then you have to go back to the good thing that got people in. So they actually are obsessed with a story that's so tightly packaged that I think they don't spend a lot of time thinking about what the good thing was that drew people in and that actually keeps them watching. Because most people, I think, don't watch cult documentaries only for the terrible thing that happens at the end. I think actually cult documentaries are really powerful for people because they feel like they can experience that thing inside that draws people and that moves people and transforms people. They can get so close with no risk, which we were talking about on the way. It's not possible, I think, inside an insular community to be unaffected, right? To have some relationship to that radical transformation or that revelation and somehow remain totally unchanged. And I think that the fantasy that we can get so close and be unchanged is part of what drives this obsession. But I actually think that people are being changed by this. I think that, like, consumption of this media, one is like making people less judgmental about the choices that drive people into, intentional communities, but also like offering this tantalizing fantasy that we can somehow have radical transformation with no risk to ourselves.
Yeah, and we were talking also about because way before I wrote this book, I was just always reading about whatever was happening in the news with cults and consuming all of things cult. Is that when you try to create a utopian community, when you gather a group of people, power dynamics will emerge. You can't really get a lot done without some kind of leadership, even if it's very conscious and it's ever shifting. And so it's always going to fall apart. I feel like even, the sort of mini culty things that happen in my life, like being in an artist residency or being on a movie set where it's a bunch of people working together. Like dynamics shift. People are popular. You want to like get the favor of the popular person, or you are the popular person. I've been told I'm a mean girl in these contexts.
Oh.
In artist residencies, I'm like, really? Wow. So, I mean, I was raised by a cult leader. It's in there, Or manipulation is sort of the language of my childhood, which maybe serves me. I don't know. I joke with in my survivor community that we're gonna and for anyone who had a traumatic childhood, which is most of us to a degree or one degree or another, like compartmentalizing is a survival tool. But like as adults, I'm just gonna call it a superpower. We're like, nope, that's not happening. I'm busy. I'm just gonna shut that down.
Okay, so but the power in a group, when we think about cults and people say they're obsessed with cults, my sense is that people are also obsessed with the leader, right? It is this idea that like when we look at cults, we're directing our eyes up there to this charismatic figure. And I have students who every semester, again, without embarrassment, and I'm delighted at their honesty, say to me, I think I'd be a great cult leader. And it's a statement like I'm obsessed with cults. I never quite am sure what they're saying, but what I suspect they're saying is I wish for the kind of charisma and like innate power that would get people to do whatever I want. And I somewhere believe that I have this perfect vision and people should do what I want.
Which is like, I mean, you just poke a little bit at that. It's just like, I'd love to be a fascist. Do you know what I mean? Like what are you really saying? You know what I mean?
But most people who are in these groups are not the leader, right? In fact, usually there's one, though, in the Lyman family.
This is sort of a court.
So what about everybody else? What does it mean to be in a group and be subject to that kind of charismatic authority? I mean, you write about it in, I think, a really beautiful and at times terrifying and at times seductive way when you talk about your time with Jessie, who sort of takes on the mantle of being
the leader. Yeah, the queen, really, is what we call her, the queen.
And so, will you talk a little bit about, at least even as a child, your sense of being in the presence of someone who had a kind of otherworldly authority and charisma and draw?
Yeah, I mean, the currency of her attention was the ultimate thing, and so there was a point in my life right before I was kicked out where she decided to favor me, and all of a sudden I was elevated from a lot of my peers. I was elevated into the sort of upper echelons of the kids of the more powerful people. I was also a lot of the girls that I grew up with were like, "Oh, you're so fancy now." Like, "Oh, you're one of the caravan kids and not one of the farm kids." And so I also got disdain. Like it became like a kind of class struggle kind of thing where I'm like rising to a different class and they're all just like, bye. And I'm like, okay, but seriously, like, don't hang out with me too much because like I got to keep this identity here. But so it was also tenuous because I had adults who didn't think I should be there. And so all of a sudden, with all this sort of fake child power, came a lot of like navigating adult dramas, and I did not realize it at the time. But looking back, a lot of what happened to me was the direct result of a woman who was just jealous of the attention I was getting and jealous of my mother for various complicated reasons and just campaigned to get rid of me. So it shoved me into adult dynamics, but I was basking in the glow of the queen. And by basking in the glow of the queen, I mean rubbing her feet. Do you know what I mean? Like very, like she was very like that until she wasn't. Until she just got sick of me, like a worn out toy. So, I mean, looking back, what I think is so interesting about her, especially these are people who were in their 20s and 30s and the 60s and 70s. Their gender roles and their ideas of all of how shit works is so totally different. And she, openly said, I think I quote her in my book saying, women are born to serve men, except apparently her. But she strategically positioned herself pretending that the leader was still alive, telling the rest of the community what he was saying, until she emerged slowly as the leader. And I mean, I don't know how everyone finally found out he was dead, because for the last 2 years I was there, he was officially alive, but I knew that he wasn't. So she also, did a kind of, a sneaky road into becoming the person in power, because I don't think if she just said, okay, I'm going to be in charge now, because she's a woman, it would have worked. So very smart. Also the wealthiest, all the money came from her, so that I'm sure helped.
So obviously, after I read the memoir, I had to Google all of the Levin family, but also Jessie. And what I found so interesting, just as you say, that on the inside, what it is and what it is on the outside is a matter of it's a matter of story, right? The obituaries for Jessie Benton. Can I say her name?
I mean, I do in the book, so yeah. She just passed away a year ago.
There are these kind of extraordinary, like, laudatory accounts of both her art and of her time building this utopian family. And there is none of the cult story, none of the good thing that ends badly. In fact, it stays a utopian community because that part of the story just doesn't get told.
Yeah. And the thing is that I don't know exactly what it's been like for them for the last few years or few decades, I should say. But I do know that is a very, very tame kind of spin on who they are and how they've lived. Although, I've been discredited by their legal team, so it would be really weird of me to make up that whole book.
But I do think that this is the thing, right? She was not in a cult. She was not the queen of a cult. And we know that because that's the narrative. Her narrative never gets to the part that is a cult. In fact, she gets to die very recently as a member of a kind of beautiful, egalitarian vision of how to live otherwise. Only you were in a cult, apparently. And I think that kind of discrepancy is part of what makes your narrative so interesting, but also the story so brutal to read, right? That there's a way in which you, as this child, watching your life and then leaving and then reflecting back, are isolated both in what happened to you, but also in the fact that you are the only one, you're one of few people who say, that's what happened. Things happened that weren't beautiful and utopian and egalitarian. Really terrible things happened because we were this insular place where no one got to call the doctor. No one called family services. No one could go to their own parent to say, I'm being married off at 13 to a person who actually everybody knows is dead.
Right.
Right? I mean, that what happened on the inside, there is no outside. There's no way to seek any kind of care or compensation.
And what's interesting too is that when I wrote this piece that I read from, that was 2019, and I really wanted to write something finally because I knew it was going to come up a lot when I was talking about my film Charlie Says, and I kind of wanted to control the narrative a little bit. And it was unbelievable how hard it was for me to do it, not from a writing standpoint, but from a knowing that they were going to be mad. No one of my generation or anyone from this family has ever spoken publicly about it, has ever written about it. And friends of mine were like, they're not a huge part of your life. They're in the past. And they're like, are you afraid they're gonna like come for you and try to, rough you up or whatever? And I'm like, no, that's not at all their vibe. I just couldn't stand to live without their approval. And I was like, what is this chip in me? Because I was literally nauseous. And writing it and being like, am I really gonna do this? And I'm like, what are you afraid of? I don't know, but I'm really afraid of it, whatever it is. And that was really interesting to me. So many years later, I'm thinking I'm all out here, la, 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 like, yeah, that was my child. And I'm like, oh God, it's right there. The fear is right there. So then writing the book actually wasn't nearly as hard because I had already crossed this line and nobody died. And like, yes, I got, grapevine, messages of disapproval or like backdoor approval, but don't tell anyone I said this. And you know what I mean? Like all sorts of complicated things, but it was fine and it felt very liberating.
I mean, I know we have to go to Q&A in a sec, but I do want to say that like that's, I think, part of what makes your story so interesting because you tell it from the perspective of being a child, but what you're narrating is also like the classic story of a family, right? It is like the moment at which you have to betray the family secret and you're out and you're an adult and you think you're whole and complete and so far from it. And the terror of betraying the family and especially the power structure of the family can feel fatal.
I really was like, am I really gonna do this? And I'm like, the New Yorker is waiting for your draft of it. Like, grown-up lady, get it together. Like, this is something any writer wants this to be published at the New Yorker or things like that. And I was, my aunt, my mom's sister, is still in the family, and New Yorker fact checkers, they really mess with people, I've learned, because they call them and ask them a bunch of questions, but they don't let them read the piece. And so it really, they called a lot of people associated with the family, their lawyers and stuff. And they just had no idea what I had written. And my aunt, who's still in the family, called me and she just was crying. She was like, please don't do this, please don't do this. And I was like, don't publish something in the New Yorker? Like, so what? And I said, but why? Like, you haven't even read it. She's like, we're just really private people. And I was like, well, you don't, we had a lot of questionable things happen to us as kids, but the one thing you cannot take away from us is that we own our stories. And that's the only power I really have and that's one of the many reasons I wrote the book the way I did. I'm not saying this is truth. I'm not saying this is science. I'm saying this is my experience, and you just can't argue with that. This is how I remember. This is what I went through, and that whole idea started when she was saying, don't do this. I was like, how do I just make it ironclad? Oh, just make it completely subjective.
I think on that note, we can open up to subjective and objective questions.
Go ahead. Maria, go ahead first. I have a couple of questions. So I'm curious in your upbringing and maybe also just broadly the educations that kids receive in these compounds or these communes. Do they encourage imaginative work, like creative writing or analysis of text, or is that just discouraged or never even introduced?
In our case, there was a list of movies called The Lord's List that we watched and were asked to write to the leader what we thought of them. So that was and they were good movies. It was all like 40s and 50s movies, mostly. And so in that way, our brains were being trained to be critical and to be an active engager with stuff. Similarly with music. He would make tapes, essentially like mixtapes, but on reels, and present them to us. And it was also music from around that era, and we were encouraged to talk about them. And of course, always with this layer of like, you chose this, so obviously it's special and magical. We can't like really say like, I don't really like that song, but it still made a critical thinking process, thought process for us when we were young. And we were we were left to our own devices a lot. So we were always inventing worlds and climbing trees and building things and, creating characters. And so it wasn't, but that's us. I know so many people who grew up in, some of the groups that are represented in the survivor community that I'm a part of is the Children of God, which is huge and very strong, and offshoots of Mormonism, Jehovah's Witness, fundamentalist Christians, and they, especially the ones that are like even more extreme versions of extreme, already what we would think of as extreme religions, are completely, like, no culture that isn't completely controlled, and no kind of work and learning that isn't scripture based or whatever their doctrine is. Constantly having to write letters to the leader. One of the two different women I know said that they're trying to. I teach a writing workshop for some of them, but they were trying to reclaim their writing because it was used as a tool against them, and they didn't want that. And there was there were some gray areas there for when I was growing up, but for the most part, it was a community founded by a musician, and so there was creativity, like being, and we were almost required to play an instrument. And I grew up playing the banjo, so there was a lot, like within all of it, there was a lot of sort of like, read this book, play this instrument, go outside and play, listen to this music. We were encouraged to engage with art, which makes it sound really kind of cute and perfect. At least we were reading the Bible over and over.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Sure.
And so I was also struck when you mentioned that there exists a remnant of this community in West Hollywood, and right, did I hear correctly?
There several of those same communities that I grew up on are still alive and well around the country, including the one that's here.
Yeah. So, and this is a question for both of you. But what have you noticed about cults that exist in urban areas, right? That can't isolate their members, like in rural, compounds. So how do they reinforce that sense of isolation?
I mean, I think that isolation, like the compound, is like a nice physical manifestation of something that already happens, right? When you're in an insular group, it kind of doesn't matter where you are. It helps if there's acres and acres between you and, somebody else. But, even when you describe being on Martha's Vineyard, that's such an interesting site of one of the communities, because actually all the the farm wasn't, but there was one in Boston, which was the first.
Yeah,
and then in
aside
LA.
from the one in Kansas, which was very isolated, we were in cities, or in places like Martha's Vineyard that are it's just a really small community in general that you couldn't not integrate.
And so I think that at some point it seems like there's not. If it works, if the insular community works right, it doesn't matter if people go off into the world. The work is happening psychologically, it's happening socially, it's happening affectively, it's happening because you feel so bonded to the people inside that, going to the store and getting candy or looking at a magazine might be some kind of relationship to the outside world, but it's never going to really fully trump the powerful work that happens within a community. So at least that's my sense, that actually, our fantasy that you have to go off into the middle of nowhere, it's helpful, and I think it often suits people's sense that they want to be farther away from the real world. But I think that the psychological and especially the emotional and social stuff is so powerful already that it matters less where you are and much more how it is to be within a family or a community.
And a great, quote unquote, a fascinating thing to look at it in that conversation is an organization called Twin Flames. They do, and they do everything. It's all they eventually. I've just seen documentaries about it and stuff that they gather together physically, but predominantly the control and the obsession and all is sort of fostered online. And I was really struck in one of the documentaries I saw that loved ones, people who weren't getting sucked into the Twin Flames universe, talked about how this person in their life was just always in the basement on their laptop, and how that was sort of a warning sign if somebody is just kind of biding their time in whatever else their life they need to do to get back to this thing. The internet has created a whole new kind of cult in which you can be anywhere, and you maybe have never even physically met these people, which is fascinating.
Can I just ask, just to follow up on the bad thing that happens, what is the threshold of something being bad, right? Because, you know, like how bad does it have to be in order for then, you know, the cult to be branded as a cult, and for, you know, because certainly, as we were talking about with the Catholic Church and other organized religions, there have been many bad things that have happened in these organized, you know, religious structures, or structures of belief or communal configurations. But, you know, is there like, what's the tipping point? What is the great gradation? Is, you know, like the Sizzler salad bar, the Sizzler salad bar, like, is that like?
We were talking about Mother God,
Yeah.
right? The Mother God one is really interesting,
Yeah.
which is, please talk about it.
But I think that there are two forms of a tipping point, and here I think your experience is really important because my sense of when a cult becomes a cult actually often has very little to do with the people inside and much more to do with the anxieties on the outside. That if you look at the moment at which we think of like, oh, it goes bad, it's when almost always, and this is my favorite like punchline about cults, like who decides something is a cult in America? It's the IRS. Because
Just like the mafia.
you know, it is, that's really where the state intervenes. And the state intervenes usually because someone on the outside is like, something bad is happening there. And sometimes that bad is there are material harms to the people inside, but also sometimes the thing that's bad is this is disruptive to my life. This is disruptive to how I think the world should be. So sometimes a cult becomes a cult because it's simply so disruptive to our incredibly narrow sense of how to be in the world. Is it often the case that when we have that like, hey, look over there, that in that insular community, bad things are happening? Yes. I don't think, though, it's quite causal. So I think inside a group, bad things happen and really intense material harms happen. You describe some of them in terms of sexual abuse, in terms of psychological control. That stuff happens partly because you have these structures of power. You have authority that is so impenetrable that they decide what is right and wrong, and they met out punishments, and there's logic only exists through the mind of one or a handful of people. So that's where, like, I think the real material dangers of these groups is that you have forms of control and power that are so ripe for violence, exploitation. I think that the FBI, IRS stuff is like a really good hook. It's like a great story. I love the Sizzler salad bar and the Rajneeshis. But I think in some ways it's like the neon sign, look over there. But what's happening inside, as you say, can go on for a very long time until there's that neon sign saying, look over there. And until that sign exists, it's just a family, it's a church, it's a self-help group.
And it should be noted, too, that the nuclear family, and if there should be a patriarchy, or a patriarch, or any parent in power who needs to control, needs to abuse, needs to do all these things, that's just a mini cult.
Yeah.
Like when people say, the Catholic Church is a cult, this is a cult, I'm like, what's a cult? The structure of the nuclear family is set up to go wrong. Absolutely. Like cult-wise and control-wise and secrets-wise and abuse-wise. So domestic violence, abusive relationships are just a mini form of coercive control, which is the same thing. It's like, it starts with love bombing, and you're so beautiful, and you're so wonderful, and I see you, and then and nobody else sees you, and then it's, and actually, your brother's kind of an a-hole, and actually your whole family is dragging you down, and then you're isolated, and then you just have this one person, and then that's when abuse starts. That's how cults work, just on a much bigger scale.
I don't think that's a coincidence that you have not just the Lyman family, but so many of these groups call themselves families because they explicitly borrow from this structure where you have usually a patriarch. But all of the things, like when you're a child or when you are, not in a position of power, you do what other people say. And even if it feels bad and you have some sense that it's not right, if you're not given the language of that, it doesn't happen. It didn't exist. It didn't happen to you. This is normal. So I think that the link between like the intense violences that happen and that uphold the nuclear family structure and these groups is not at all accidental.
Hi, I love this conversation, and I was just really struck by the idea of how this situation is like both porous and isolate, like how like the world enters into the cult somehow, but also is so isolating in like this play between these two dynamics. But what I was really interested in is how does one even, like if you come out of a cult or this kind of insular system, group system, what do? Do you like reproduce it in a way, as a way to like restructure it, like like change the meaning and construct around it, or do you like give up on it? Because I was thinking in terms of like just how we have like the notion of faith in like how do you like trust the world again? In like, do you think everyone's in cults so you would disown everybody and just be alone, or would you like try to rebuild it, and therefore the risk of recreating the very system that kind of traumatized you? So I was interested.
My personal situation is very singular. Also, I was young, so what I could create or recreate was obviously very limited. But what I've learned from so many of the women, it is literally like 180 people, maybe this group that I'm a part of, it's 99% women. It's not just because I speculated recently, why is it all women? It's like, well, because the men just wait around and grow up and then they have power. The women are like, this is not getting better, this is just gonna get worse. But anyway, that's a sidebar. So many of them accidentally join another cult and and that takes them five years to realize that, because they're so used to a kind of environment where they're told what to do. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people in the exit counseling cult space that are predators. And so I've met many women who are like, and then 5 years later, I was like, oh shit, I'm in another thing. It's maybe it's just free labor for a charismatic doctor, and all of a sudden I'm also living with him and his wife, and all of a sudden maybe it's a sexual relationship, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that is a thing that happens a lot. And for a lot of these women that I know, they got out of a cult that they were born into 20 years ago. Only now are they like, okay, I got to stop repeating these patterns. So I think that's the hard thing, is that you're not given the tools to think for yourself, and so sometimes that just means you just keep doing it.
I think also when you leave a structure that gives you everything, right? Meaning, authority, you leave and you are bereft. You may have left for totally good logical reasons, for your own well-being, for the well-being of your children. You know it's bad, but suddenly all of that's gone. I mean, there is like the kind of like the vast then open emptiness of life, the thing that drives people into insular communities, the search for that kind of structure. To lose it is incredibly traumatic. So you can see how people might try and find it in other ways and may start thinking it can be found piecemeal. But as we all know in our lives, right, piecemeal forms of it aren't nearly as satisfying as like the one-stop shop to every, total meaning in your life and purpose and community and love. And it's pretty compelling.
Yeah, and a lot of the, and this is true for me to a degree, I don't not believe some of the things I was raised to believe. Like, it kind of never goes away. Like, I was raised to believe that the earth is school, and that I've been here too many times, and that once you finally learn whatever it is you're supposed to be learn on this planet, then you move on to another existence. Part of me still believes that I'm like Matthew McConaughey in what movie where the high school movie where he's the guy who's way too old and he's still hanging out with the high school kids.
Fast Times at Ridgemont High. No, that's not.
Dazed and Confused.
Dazed and Confused.
Because I can't remember when I wasn't told that I've been here too many times and that I have something to learn, and so that doesn't go away. That didn't go away. Like, I'm still sort of like, what am I supposed to learn?
But that's also like that's a version of Buddhism. I mean, that is like
right. That's right. It's borrowed from
I mean, that's the thing. You could go out in the world and then be like, oh, actually, maybe what I am is a Buddhist, because I'm figuring this out until I figure it out, I'm going to be back. So
Yeah,
There's no
that's the other
reason
thing
not
is
to
that a
believe
lot of the things that I was raised with are, you can feel that, but how they were sort of pulled from all of these places that, and I'm like, it's not to me a terrible or necessarily wrong or fantastical idea that there is reincarnation and that we continue to go through and we evolve once we learn things. But I'm sort of just waiting to die so I can see if I evolve and make me back here.
I mean, if it makes you feel better, I'm pretty sure you're not the reason that the spaceship didn't come. It
wasn't my fault.
I don't think it was your fault. I don't think it's because you needed to be here for another lesson that you guys didn't all get to go to Venus.
But some part of my little child self is still guilty about that. I mean, that's the weird thing and this is true of anyone's childhood, right? There's certain things that happen that no matter how much your grown-up brain tells you what was really going on, some little part of your child is still there being like, but it's my fault. When are we going to Venus? In case you're wondering what's weird about me. I think it's my fault that we're not all living on Venus.
I don't know if it's relevant, but I mean, you're talking about those kind of, we are not talking about mega kind of cults or organizations that are tied to like police or, I particularly have in mind the Church of Scientology and the problems with challenging it and the problems that comes with this ally with LAPD, and it's kind of a situation when you're powerless really to act on it, to go and protest it. There's a high chance to be arrested. So doing it by media, again, they're well tied to media. So what may be the approach to challenging the mega cults like Church of Scientology?
Scientology it's so interesting. I mean, this is why the IRS is like, you can see the IRS has literally met its match with the Church of Scientology, because this has been many decades of especially people who've defected trying to actually break down this whole system by attacking its tax-exempt status. And the sense is like, if you start to chip away at its massive money, like insane money, maybe then you'll chip away at its power. But I think it is the extreme case. But that form of control that's sometimes bolstered by actual things on the outside, the LAPD. Sometimes, though, groups can prosper without that because you have God, or you have, the promise of the end times, or you have, right? I mean, the kind of physical power of the LAPD is a manifestation usually of some larger power that's always there that bolsters what happens on the inside. It's actually, I think the LAPD is less terrifying than the idea of a God who speaks to a single person on earth, right? That's real, intense power.
That person actually believes it and feels empowered by that and with this absolute kind of message, right?
And other
right.
people believe them. So,
right.
So there's a way in which, it happens even without that big system. I mean, these are the structures of control that make it possible. I mean, Scientology is also just a fascinating.
Did you know a friend of mine is working on a podcast on this subject? So when that therapist told me, you grew up in a cult, not a commune, she gave me this newsletter from this place called the Cult Awareness Network. And they were this sort of watchdog group that were activists that were sort of actively creating, this was the early 90s, actively creating spaces for survivors, for people to go and sort of, exit counseling and, figure out how to be a person not in a cult. And Scientology bought it. They bought the Cult Awareness Network, and they are still operating as the Cult Awareness Network, but it's actually Scientology. And that I know, Scientology does not play. You know more about that?
No, I don't. I was just wondering, with them having that power, that scale, how is that Leah Remini end up becoming the catalyst that probably at least brought it down a few pegs, if not totally obliterated?
I mean, she must live in a very, very fearful life because they're so powerful. But I mean, you know what her protection is? She's a public figure. Exactly. You know what I mean? So they're like, if all of a sudden Leah Remini disappears, like David Miscavige's wife, it's going to get attention in ways that they don't want. But they are, I mean, I know a cult deprogrammer who testified against them in some kind of case like 10 years ago. They destroyed him. They sued him. They sued everything, like any piece of property asset. They like decimated. He had to start from scratch because he spoke out against them and called them the C word. They are not a cult. They are a new religion.
A church.
A church. They're a church.
They're a church. But also, I think if you're savvy about it, you always let a detractor speak, right? I mean, that's part of the plan. Like, you have to let...
In a rebound, yeah.
Yeah.
No,
They
but
have a Scientology network now. They never would have thought of it if there wasn't a public figure who was going to do what that's going to say.
But you have to let someone like Leah Remini speak, because if you forced her into silence or if you disappeared her, then you would be a cult. You see, you bolster the claim you're not a cult by being like, if we were a cult...
Would we let this happen?
We wouldn't let this happen, right? There is, I mean, this is the thing, that the word cult comes with like a story and like a way that we react, but also there's like a kind of defensive PR strategy built in too. Would we do this if we were a cult? See all the ways in which we are not a cult. Avert your eyes from the things that make you think we are. But I mean, I think that that's why the word is both useful and not, because it does tell us one way to react to something, but it also offers a system by which people can be like, we're a different kind of maybe good, maybe bad thing. Just don't call us a cult.
Yeah, Keith Raniere, who's the guy who, made Nexium and is now in prison, he would constantly say, we're not a cult. Ha, people say we're a cult. Like, kind of trying to reclaim the word and somehow, and that's it. Like, there's this woman, Teal Swan, who is doing all sorts of stuff. It's jaw-dropping, constantly saying, I'm not a cult, this is not a cult. Which, how do you, you're looking at a penguin that's just like, I'm not a penguin. You're like, okay, well, I guess you get to call yourself what you want. You look like a penguin to me. You know what I mean? You can't really fight it.
Yeah, so you said the IRS is basically kind of like the checks and balances system of who gets labeled a cult in the United States. Do you have any knowledge of what that looks like for cults that are happening elsewhere?
I wouldn't call it checks and balances at all. I mean, let's not turn the IRS into a hero. Like, I mean, it is
accidental hero, really. Yeah.
I mean, it is. I just think it's like the reason I say the IRS is because I think, believe somehow that a cult is something that's affective, and it's actually just a legal term, or like a kind of socio-legal term, and the IRS is like a useful way to point out that like that's just a word we give to a problem. Globally, there aren't really checks and balances for groups, but I do think it's interesting that America has so many groups that we would call cults, far, far more than most other places. I think, and you can't really count cults.
Yeah, that's the thing.
Someone asked me the other day, they were like, oh, isn't it true that there are 20,000 cults in America? And I was like, how would we know that?
Right, because there's probably 20,000 more who are really good at just not being known.
But also, like, would we go door to door with like
are you a cult?
But
is there a cult thing on the census?
No, exactly.
We're not like big on census people in cults.
But in Japan, there have been quite a few really visible groups that have been called cults, and
Australia also.
I think highly industrialized countries in which there's like a kind of either recent or structural like decimation of forms of like social cohesion between people that aren't like the nuclear family. I think, when you have places where people have forms of life and connection that are much more horizontal, that like hold them in place, it's much harder than I think to have like the kind of force of the single person who'll tell you the meaning of life. But there's no regulation, right? Because it's sort of not a thing.
A cult is not a crime.
Yeah,
that's
it's not
the
a
thing.
crime.
The cult is not a crime. It's just that they often, though at least the ones we know, commit crimes and get caught. Excuse me.
Could
And you said the FBI's not here. They're just going. I guess they're just going after the money. That's what.
Yeah, they're just doing their job, which is, there's money that we're not getting.
Currently, your tax unpaid, and that's where it starts.
Yeah.
And then it ends up with the other stuff. With the FBI.
Mm-hmm.
Could I just ask a quick question, Poulomi, of, the description of your project, which is related to a kind of, because to follow up Newton's question about what are some of the kind of global constraints, if in the U.S. it's the IRS, then what globally halts the sort of cultivation or emergence of cults. I just wanted to ask about the genealogy that you presented in the brief description about the kind of fascination with Indian culture and religions and spiritual life that led to, at a certain historical moment, the proliferation of, I guess, cult or cultish imaginary in the U.S. Like, could you just quickly give a little gloss, or at least one little tantalizing point from that?
Sure. I mean, I think that part of my argument is that, contemporary yoga, mindfulness, and this like kind of obsessive attachment that we have to it is not a new thing. It's actually part of a long American experiment. And that experiment is about finding a radical alternative to how we're supposed to be. And, I pinpoint like a fairly early moment, like 1805, I say. It's a set of letters between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson where they're reading about the Vedas and, Vedic philosophy, and they're really taken by the idea of like a transcendental soul. And they find this idea that we're not these contained, rational, beings, so philosophically interesting. They're like, wow, yeah, what if we weren't what we have to be in America, which are like Enlightenment subjects, rational, individual, contained. And they're really interested in this philosophically and terrified of it as an actual like religious or spiritual practice, right? They think that like what those heathens do in India is terrifying, but the philosophy is really kind of interesting. But the reason it can be interesting to them is they're not reading any philosophy. They're not reading the Vedas. They're not even reading the good Germans who are translating Sanskrit into German. They're reading third-hand accounts of American theologians, reading British scholars, reading the German Orientalists. And what they get is something that they can totally make up. They can borrow these terms, like let's say the vague structure of reincarnation that you grew up knowing without the word. That is a classic American form that you can take an idea and simply remove it from its citation, remove all the like difficult stuff of religion, ritual, rules, genealogies, language, knowledge, and instead you can take a good idea and make something with it. That America is a land where the idea of like innovating around religion is a good thing rather than heresy, which is what it is in most places, which is why the Catholic Church is always like an interesting cult, because they love to call other things heretic. But when you can constantly innovate, the possibility of building really compelling alternatives that seem to sidestep all the limits, right? So a good example are the Hare Krishnas, who began in America. They were, brought in by an quite old Indian man who arrived in 1965. And he arrived because when he was in India trying to gather followers, he was one of like tens of thousands of godmen. There's no cults in India because there's no kind of restriction on how you can be spiritually, right? Everyone has a particular guru and they, abide by those rituals. So he couldn't gather any followers, and he was like, screw this. And he comes to America and he's like, I can gather followers if I give you the idea of like a kind of radical transcendental consciousness. You don't have to have any rituals. Don't worry about learning, scripture. Don't worry about what you wear. And he says all you have to do is chant. Here are 4 words. Just chant them over and over again, and there's transcendence for you. That's really compelling.
And it really worked.
And it totally works because also he's like, and I'm telling you it's true because people have been doing this for millennia over there. Don't ask how they did it. Just know that
Right.
I'm telling you that they did it for millennia there. So it's the ability to make it up so it can be super compelling that I think invites a kind of enthusiastic following also, right? When you have somebody who's like, you're like, oh, wow. Yeah, you know, when I think about religion, that's actually exactly what I want. You're offering me all the good stuff without all of the hard stuff. I'm in.
And there's this kind of like really presumptive, cherry picking of and fetishization of. It's sort of like, well, this old Indian man came over here to tell us all this stuff. It must be true because Indian people are spiritual and he's old and he's not
old.
like us. Do you know what I mean?
know, exactly.
And it's like this. It's legit. Whereas over there, everyone's like, "What are you talking about, old man?" There's like so many of you. There's like an inherent kind of colonial,
course.
fetishization of like otherworldliness.
Well, people have to play the part. How are you going to be a leader if you don't play the part? You have to like put on the costume. You have to have the persona, whether it is like spiritual or any of these other kind of groups. Like you have to sell it. This is good marketing, right? And that's how you get a successful intentional community.
And
Marketing.
on that note, the advice line at the end.
And that's how you become a cult leader.
Exactly. Please thank Professor Saha and Guinevere Turner.
Thank you all for coming.